Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of what if Deku's Spar partner was actually Shoto? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. When he realized that he didn't want to go to Seoul Nia like Momo, he'd gotten a bit insecure. They'd been in the same class for about 3 years, and she was his first and only friend. To be willingly separating from her wasn't an easy choice. The fear of drifting apart had eaten at him for a long time. In the end, Izuku realized that he'd never forgive himself if he didn't go to Deveron. There was only so long that his uncle would be able to train him. Most of his training already was being taken over by his father and Jurepa. Night Eye only had him for 2 days a week, and if he went to Deveron he'd be willing to pick it up to 4 days every other week on top of the regular 2-day weeks. It wasn't much, but it was still something he needed. The dojo didn't have nearly enough room for a full-scale obstacle course like the one Uncle Night Eye kept, and that was the thing that tipped the scales. Telling Momo that he'd be going to a different school was really the hardest part of it all. He felt a bit bad for choosing his training over Momo, but she understood. They'd both promised to talk every day and hang out every Sunday and any weekday they could. Izuku would never forget the way she smiled and said, "We'll both be going to UA anyways, so it will only be for a little while." Of course he just smiled and said, "Exactly," ending the dilemma. But every time someone told him that, his heart always stilled and his body would feel so cold. He never stuttered anymore. He still got a bit over-emotional around people he was comfortable with, told a lot of bad jokes, and was as quirkless as they come. It was a bit of sore point, one that Momo couldn't possibly know he had, that getting into UA wasn't as sure of a thing for him as most people tended to assume. But he'd learned to be pretty resilient since he did have a lot going for him regardless of, as his family tended to phrase it, the nature of his abilities. So, with Momo and Izuku talking every day through text and video chat homework sessions, he was bound to bring up Shoto, who he actually called Shoto, and who actually called him by his given name too, because Izuku was kind of conditioned to be overly friendly with people he liked. It sounded bad to phrase it that way, but Izuku supposed there had to be some kind of weird side effects having his dad be All Might, and if being weirdly affectionate with his friends and crying on them once in a while was it, then so be it. Momo, of course, immediately perked up and became excited. She practically demanded to meet his new friend who had a standing sparring session with on Fridays. He of course promised he'd do his best, but it wasn't exactly as easy as all that. Shoto had a lot of things he was dealing with. The fact that Endeavor didn't even know that they were friends was one of them. The way Shoto talked about his father was a can of worms Izuku thought he could open just yet. There was something deeply wrong there, and he wasn't quite sure how to broach that subject just yet without scaring his new friend off. So Izuku began to talk to Shoto about Momo. He told him all about her quirk and how she had been his first friend ever and how nice she was. Izuku did his best to build her up and finally executed the final move by saying, "My friend Momo really wants to meet you, so I was kind of wondering if you could join us for a movie or something after school on Saturday." Shoto, who stood across the mat from him and was looking at him like he had a second head because that kind of came out a bit nervously, replied with, "Maybe. I don't know. Do you ever get pictures taken of the two of you when you're out together?" They were a bit older now than when they had first met. When he entered middle school, his father had a long discussion with him about how a lot of things were going to change very quickly in the next few years, and it was going to feel like a hurricane in his brain sometimes. And while that was all well and good to know that it was another to be just past 13 and being able to do things like actually go out with Momo to watch movies at the cinema and even lunch without needing a parent or guardian as long as they stayed in heavily heroed areas, it was fine. This meant that, yes, the press did like getting pictures of them together and plastering them across tween magazines like they were some sort of specimen to be analyzed. That was the problem because Shoto would absolutely say no. If there was even one picture of him and Shoto in a magazine together, something would happen. Izuku wasn't sure what, but Shoto seemed to know, and it wasn't shaping up to be a good thing. When Izuku had first told his dad that he'd made friends with number 2 hero's son, he'd made this face that Izuku didn't quite understand until he got to know Shoto better, and yeah, them being friends was definitely going to ring some alarm bells somewhere and maybe even bring about the downfall of modern society or some shit like that. But his dad had said it was fine. Because other people's weird ideas about imbalances of power and the rise of some sort of unholy alliance between All Might and Endeavor's offspring. So yeah, there would probably be pictures, so DMN. Unless, if we go out to this one Korean barbecue joint will be okay, otherwise there will be pictures, Izuku finally replied. It's run by a retired pro hero and my family goes there whenever we don't want to be seen. There's this private booth. If you want I can get that all reserved and we can meet her there. The other boy seemed thoughtful before seeming to come to a decision. Yeah. There's an arcade that I know that has blacked windows and doesn't let the press in. We can take a bus there afterwards if you want. Feeling a surge of happiness, Izuku nodded. Yeah, I'll tell her. After that the two of them ran the obstacle course. Izuku won that day but Shoto was quickly catching up. On his way home he had a quick text conversation with Momo that went, Izuku, Shoto is up for some barbecue and an arcade he likes on Saturday. Great. Where's the place at so I can tell my parents? Izuku, /_, Emochan, Izuku. Izuku, he'll send me the address when he gets home. Emochan, okay fine. Sounds like fun. I hope it all works out. Izuku finished it off with a simple, me too, then contemplated how he was going to tell his parents he was moving his friendship with Shoto from the safety of his uncle's agency to a place they could be photographed. Getting home Izuku called out into the house with a cheerful, here I am. It was an odd custom but it's how they did it in the Yagi household. His mother called back with a cheerful, Izuku we're in the back garden. After his shoes were removed he placed his bag on the small bench by the door and slipped on his house shoes before making his way out back to them. Bounding out the rear door Izuku caught sight of them sitting together on a mat in the grass under their tree. When he reached them he fell to his knees and wrapped his arms around his mother enthusiastically as she laughed at his antics. Quickly he removed himself from her and did the same to his dad as his mother called a welcome home. Izuku sat next them on the extra space afforded on the mat and smiled happily, a perfectly real smile for his family. How was your day? His mother was always the first to answer. All right. Nina at the market says that they should have a good batch of seasonal fruit coming in since it's summer now. I was thinking of making a cake to have with them as toppings. Izuku laid back onto the grass and looked at the branches as they swayed in the light summer breeze. That sounds really yummy, maybe we can have Momo over for it or can take some to her. That would be lovely. Maybe I should invite the Yayorozu family. She cheered. It would be nice to have summer picnic with them again. Finally his father spoke. That would be really nice. They haven't been over in some time, it would be good to see them again. Izuku sat up again to look at his dad. How was your day? The hero chuckled a bit and smiled softly. It was a bit of a rasp and Izuku wondered if he'd stretched himself thin again. I spread my 6 hours out for a good portion of the morning and afternoon. He'd seen it on He Knew's app, and while his dad knew that he knew, it was still nice to hear it from him. I saw that nasty situation downtown with the carjackers. I'm glad everyone is okay. The man nodded. It was a bit touch and go for a bit but it turned out all right. Then both of them grinned and in unison said, it turned out all might. Making them both laugh at the unimpressed face his mother made. How was your day, Izuku? The woman smiled encouragingly. It wasn't as if he kept it from her anymore, but he supposed it did seem rather recent that he was more comfortable telling her things that happened at school. After all, he never liked talking about it back when he shared a class with Kachin. It was okay. We have a few tests coming up. Oh! He suddenly exclaimed as if he'd just remembered. Shoto said he'd like go with Momo and me to barbecue after school on Saturday and hang out at an arcade if you were okay with it. Pulling out his phone he checked his email to see if Shoto had sent the address and he had. Izuku handed his phone over after clicking on the link and having it display the arcade's information. His father took the phone and looked over it with his mother. Izuku held his breath for a moment and released it to calm himself. He was obviously just nervous because he wanted to be able to hang out with his sparring partner somewhere that wasn't a gym and he wanted him and Momo to meet and become friends. If his parents said no, they were just looking out for him. It wasn't like he didn't know how dangerous it could be out there for him. After a good few moments his parents seemed to confer before handing back his phone. Izuku. His father began, and he did his best not to tense in anticipation. We're going to say yes, but you must understand our worry. Endeavor, while I do wish it was different, doesn't exactly like me. Izuku nodded. He'd known. Shoto had kind of told him a little bit about it, but he hadn't really gotten into detail about the whole affair. We just want to make sure you know that if Todoroki isn't telling his dad about this, the repercussions could be bad. Not for us, but for him. Izuku stopped to think. He'd known on some level that was the case. No one just didn't tell their parent they'd made a friend unless they were afraid of something. That something, Izuku expected he might know what it was. He knows his father better than anyone else. Izuku replied, I trust his judgment. His mother sighed, then gave him a weak smile. Oh Izuku, I know you care about him, but… Mom, please. He frowned. He could feel the mixed emotions burning at the back of his throat. He was on his knees looking at the ground, almost bowing now. I'm the only friend he has. I at least know what that's like, and I can't stand to watch him be so lonely. Suddenly he felt a hand on his head. Lifting his face, Izuku found his father in front of him with a rather tender expression on his face. I don't know what from, but you're trying to save him, aren't you? Izuku felt the tears burning now. He wasn't even sure what it was, but he could only reply with a firm yes. Didn't fall, but his dad hugged him like he was once again a small child who had hurt himself out playing in the yard. Then it's okay. We'll stand with you, Izuku. That Saturday Momo had texted him a reply finally that just said, Dad says if All Might says yeah, it's fine. So that meant against what Izuku felt like was all odds that dinner and an evening at an arcade was a go. Izuku, feeling rather giddy, made a group chat with the three of them and sent out. Izuku, looks like Operation Thin Ice is a go. Emo-chan, we're not calling it that. Shoto, I don't have another name for it. Emo-chan, why does it even need a name? Izuku, because this is a covert operation, okay? Emo-chan, it really isn't. Shoto, I agree with Izuku. Izuku. Shoto, did you just call me Izuku? Shoto, is that wrong? I thought it was a code name. It is your chat name. Emo-chan, Ameo, greater than over equal to less than over equal to. You forgot to change the settings. Shoto has changed his name to Shochan. Shochan, now we all match. Emo-chan, greater than over equal to less than over equal to. Izuku. Why are you doing this? Shochan, if you two have code names, then I need one too. Emo-chan, section, he's right, we all need code names if this is a covert operation. Izuku, I don't want you two to meet now. Operation Thin Ice is cancelled. Emo-chan, my bus just got to school. I have to go. See you later, Izuku. I look forward to meeting you, Todoroki. Shochan, goodbye, Yayorozu. Izuku, see you. Izuku sighed and closed his phone. His bus would be getting to school as well, and he'd talk to Shoto there. Shaking his head, he sighed. Shoto had this air about him, and while Izuku was sure he was joking sometimes, the other boys seemed to just be really bad at most social interactions. But that had to have been him teasing, right? No one just started calling you by such a baby name unless they were teasing? He'd heard Night Eye use it. Was Shoto jealous of the rapport he and Momo had? He had to be just teasing. Well, at least Shoto was the kind of guy he could just ask up front about it. When he reached his class, Izuku was immediately met by a grim-faced Shoto who said, We've only just started calling each other by our given names. I'm sorry if I overreached my bounds. Izuku felt a bit embarrassed by the whole thing and chuckled to try and alleviate any awkwardness either of them were feeling by going the Momo route and saying, No, it's fine if you call me that in chat as long I can call you by your code name there as well. Shoto nodded. That was supposed to be a joke, but in hindsight I don't know if it was appropriate to be talking that way in a chat with a girl. I've grown too used to talking to you casually in our own text conversations. Trying not to push an already awkward Shoto, Izuku nodded and replied, It's fine. Momo would have been angry if she thought you were being inappropriate. She just thought it was funny, but if you still feel awkward about it you can apologize to her when you meet. Shoto nodded again. He seemed to be pulling back into himself, and Izuku had to wonder if he was just nervous about meeting Momo. That would explain the uncharacteristic display in the chat. Izuku smiled. You know I'd like to tap you on the back once in a while to reassure you or something, is that okay? A small tentative smile graced Shoto's features. Yeah, that's fine. So, Izuku tapped him twice on the back and cheered, "You'll do fine. You and Momo will be great friends in no time." They weren't too similar and they weren't too different, so Izuku dearly hoped they got along. Images of Kachan's posse filled his head and other children like Ando who had whole groups of friends. Yeah, he really hoped they got along. Shoto had no idea what he was doing really. Izuku kept telling him he was doing fine. But Izuku wasn't exactly normal when it came to social interactions either, so while Shoto trusted the other boy, he wasn't exactly a perfect standard measurement for these things. He'd do his best to shrug it off and apologize to Yaoyorozu when they got to the restaurant. Izuku sat next to him on the bus and was texting her to say they were almost at their stop. Shoto on the other hand was trying to figure out how to even apologize for what he'd said. The best method was an upfront one, he supposed. Neither of them had changed their name in the group chat, and for some reason Izuku was using that same chat to text her now. It was a bit odd for him that if he wanted to he could be privy to a conversation that only involved to him peripherally, so for now he just ignored the messages making his phone ping. While he was a bit nervous to meet someone Izuku had known for years, it wasn't something he was too worried about. Izuku was his friend. If he didn't get along with Yaoyorozu, he'd at least be willing to try and put up with her for Izuku's sake. Maybe. That didn't matter though, because he hadn't even met her yet and he still had to apologize for being overly familiar. The bus reached their stop and both of them disembarked and made their way down the block to the restaurant that Yaoyorozu was already waiting inside of. Izuku inhaled deeply next him, then let out a "let's go" before smiling. That was when Shoto realized that his friend was nervous. Don't be what?" Izuku chuckled. "Nervous." The other boy just chuckled in a rather uncharacteristically jittery fashion. "I have to be. My two friends are meeting and I kind of want us all to be best friends or something, and I know that those are some really high expectations, but I can't help it. I've never had more than one friend before." That startled Shoto a bit, but not as much as it would have a few months ago. Izuku hadn't tried to make friends with any of their classmates, and at first Shoto thought it was because he was keeping the other boy from being social. Later he realized, when everyone found out Izuku was All Might's son, all the other kids kind of set the two of them on some sort of weird pedestal to be admired from afar. Which was weird. Shoto was used to being either feared or having people volunteer to be his posse or something. Maybe that's why Izuku only had one friend. Because they all treated him so oddly once they knew who he was. That meant Yaoyorozu had reacted differently. Just as Shoto had. That made him curious and her worth getting to know. He supposed he had a bit of respect for her already in that sense. "If we don't get along," Shoto tried to assure him, "I'll put up with her if you want to hang out with both of us later." Izuku looked at him seriously before actually smiling. "You're a really good friend, you know. But I won't make you guys hang out if you don't get along." Shoto just nodded. Izuku really wasn't one to make anyone do anything they didn't want to. They reached the restaurant and requested the reservation for Yagi. Then the server brought them to a row of small private rooms along the back and opened one to reveal a rather well put together middle school girl who Shoto assumed was Yaoyorozu. Izuku thanked the server and went in to sit across from the girl, and he joined his friend on the same side of the small table. They all sat on pillows placed on the ground. The grill had already started heating and there were some sides on the table. They ordered their drinks and the server left to fetch them. "They're bringing a couple servings of meat and some cold yakisoba to start us with. If there's anything else you want, I'm sure you can ask them for it then." The girl informed them as they got comfortable. "This is Yaoyorozu Momo," Izuku announced and gestured towards her, "and this is Todoroki Shoto." Then he made the same gesture but towards him. "It's good to meet you finally." She smiled excitedly. Shoto nodded and replied, "I must apologize for being too forward in the group chat earlier." Yaoyorozu nodded. "That's okay. I wasn't offended, but I have developed a strange sense of propriety thanks to this weirdo." She then gestured to Izuku, who sputtered indignantly. "He is a bit uncultured sometimes, isn't he?" Shoto asked, entirely serious, causing her to smirk slyly. "See, Izuku, you're completely inappropriate when it comes to proper Japanese manners." Izuku suddenly started laughing. "You say that, but nobody." ever complained until now. Suddenly Shoto realized why that was. That's because you're All Might's son, you get away with it because that's how he acts. Yaoyorozu actually started laughing at the face Izuku was pulling now. It was obvious to Shoto that he wasn't offended but was just reacting to make her laugh, and he wondered if this is what friendship was usually like. He'd never spent time with Izuku outside of their training sessions and texts they sent about class. Izuku was always joking and making sure he was comfortable with how they interacted, and it was such a different experience to see him this way. With an old friend who he had already negotiated all those things with. Once again Shoto sat looking at Izuku and his life and yearned for it. Suddenly Izuku's voice broke his thoughts. I see how it is. You just wanted to meet him so you both could gang up on me. He laughed playfully. Then Shoto felt a deep contentment settle in his stomach. It wasn't just Izuku's life anymore, their paths had merged and it would take time, but he'd have the same level of comfort with Izuku as Yaoyorozu did one day. With a sudden surety he knew he'd wait for it. You picked us. Shoto suddenly replied, then took a sip of the soda that they had been served, causing both Yaoyorozu to stop and look at him surprised. Then they smiled and Izuku replied. Yeah, I didn't I? Todoroki, Yaoyorozu began, getting the conversation back to less rambunctious levels. I ordered some basics but I had no idea what you liked, so there's plenty of room for more on the table. Shoto thought for a moment. You said you ordered cold yakisoba, that should be fine. I'm not really picky when it comes to the meats at these sort of places. Yaoyorozu nodded in agreement. They have really good pork belly though, you should try it. I will. Shoto answered, then pulled back into his head trying to figure out a list of questions that he could ask to keep the conversation going. Yaoyorozu beat him again though. What do you like to do for fun? Both of his companions looked at him happily. There wasn't really any pressure and he appreciated it. I don't really do much besides train and study. He replied, feeling like it was a bit insufficient. The two of them obviously had a lot more free time. Oh, so like us then? Yaoyorozu smiled encouragingly. Shoto was a bit surprised by that response. To the life of a hero in training. Izuku chimed in and lifted his glass. Yaoyorozu lifted hers as well, and while it was all a bit foreign to him, it was a sentiment he could get behind, and lifted his glass to meet theirs in a clink. They all drank and Yaoyorozu continued. I think it's been that way since I started training when I was 7. The only reason Izuku and I are even friends is because we went to the same primary and had a lot of study sessions and even did our workouts together for a while. That was something that had surprised him, and it probably shouldn't have. He'd known they had been training for years too, but to think they had become friends the same way he had met them. We were worried we'd lose touch, but we make sure to text each other a lot about little things that happen through the day, even it's just to complain about people in class or homework. Izuku supplied happily. We actually only hang out on Sundays. Today is kind of special. We set it aside just for you. A sense of warmth started to build in his chest. He could feel his jaw tremble at the emotion he was feeling. To think that these two had set aside an entire day just to spend with him. Thank you, he replied softly. His voice didn't shake but his heart did. No problem. Izuku enthused. We'll keep inviting you too if you like. That was something he'd like very much. Momo was enjoying herself a lot. The food came and they were all eating, sharing little stories about school and wayward classmates. She told a few stories about 9-year-old Izuku who had loved to be called Small Might after that Heroes Initiative interview, and Izuku told stories about how she had accidentally made a bomb when she was practicing her simple chemicals. Todoroki seemed to prefer to stick to the antics of people from school or on the street. So while Izuku was telling a story about the time his dad had picked him up over his head in the middle of a store when he was 11, Momo just studied their new companion. To her he seemed reserved. He had moments of mirth and humor and told some rather strange renditions of jokes, but all in all he just seemed shy. She liked him and was glad Izuku had made a new friend. As for herself, she was back to being ignored by most her class the moment they realized she was completely focused on her studies. It was strange. Some people had invited her out on Sundays but she declined. Izuku had told her it was fine to invite people on their outings if she wanted, but nobody really ever seemed good enough. It was hard finding someone you clicked with when most of your classmates were on career paths in their parents' companies or chasing some dream of fame. She was the only person in her class that wanted to be a hero. Sure, there were some people from primary in her current class, but it wasn't like she had made tons of friends there either. So, when Izuku had told her he made a friend, she was a bit jealous. When Momo had first met him, Izuku was shy and muttered out his sentences and cried when he got really happy or sad. To be honest, he still did the crying on a smaller scale and only around people he knew well, but the rest of it was gone. He was outgoing now and had a lot more confidence than she did. She kind of felt like his new friend would steal him away forever. Then he told her who he was. That he was chasing the hero track to UA like them, and she realized that maybe he hadn't changed at all. Meeting Todoroki filled her with so much relief. He was someone she could appreciate. He seemed like someone who worked so hard that he'd never made any friends anywhere. Part of her wondered if that's who she would be if she'd never met Izuku. Someone so to themselves who only had their brain and their training. Momo was glad Izuku brought him. Todoroki seemed like he needed few friends. Focusing back on the conversation at hand, Izuku was to the part where Mr. Yagi had been scolded by Inko for being so reckless in the middle of the store where anyone could see them, and Shoto was smiling humorously at the enthusiastic way Izuku was telling the story. "How many times has he dropped you?" Momo teased, and Izuku glared playfully at her. "I'll have you know he's only dropped me once. And that was just a couple weeks ago during training." She shook her head and chuckled. Todoroki stopped smiling then and looked a bit thoughtful, then a bit concerned. "You're really sturdy, Izuku, but your dad is about 8 feet tall, and for someone your height that's a pretty high drop." Momo snorted, and Izuku looked at him with the most offended expression that Momo just couldn't deal with and had to take a drink of her soda to stop herself from choking. As they got ready to leave their booth, Izuku took off his school uniform's blazer and put it in his backpack. Then he looked to Shoto and smiled. "You want to put yours in here too?" Shoto nodded and took his off and folded it up, then handed it over to him. "Do you have something for my hair in there?" Izuku pulled out a hoodie and slipped it on and offered Shoto the hat he'd brought with him. It was just a simple black ball cap that he'd used on several occasions when he'd went on family outings. With a simple thank you, Shoto placed the cap on his head and tucked as much of hair as he could into it. Momo just took her jacket that was folded on the pillow next to her and put it on. Izuku knew it was a bit of an ordeal to go anywhere when your parents were famous, and there was the paranoia of paparazzi that could be hiding around every corner, but today was extra dangerous. Momo understood and didn't make any silly comments about it either. When the trio was all set, they paid their bill and made their way down the block and kept walking. The arcade Shoto had told them about was only a few blocks away, and since it was still early evening they had enough daylight to walk. They'd only have a couple hours, but it was enough for them to relax some more. Izuku walked in front while Shoto and Momo walked just slightly behind him to make sure that there was enough room on the sidewalk for anyone else using it. It was a busy area, so there was still loads of people doing their shopping and just enjoying their weekend. He could already see about 4 heroes patrolling the busy streets when he turned to Shoto and asked, "So how'd you find this arcade? I'd never heard of it until now." Shoto replied easily, "My sister talks about going there with her friends a lot, and she's even taken both my brothers. I've never been there, but if they can go then it's safe." Izuku and Momo nodded. They both knew how hard it could be to find a place to just hang out and not be harassed by strangers. They weren't heroes yet, and they shouldn't really be having to deal with that sort of thing. When they reached the arcade, Shoto decided to keep the hat on, and Izuku took off his hoodie and used the sleeves to wrap it around his waist. Momo said he looked like a dork whenever he did it, but this was convenient, and if he tied it over his shoulders it would make him warm. Plus he was already wearing a backpack to carry his stuff, so it would be doubly inconvenient. They played a few video games but ended up spending most of their time at the air hockey table, taking turns in an infinite tournament of the third observer playing the winner. Shoto was playing against Momo, and they were locked in a point war with 5-5 and 3 minutes on the board. They were the only ones playing air hockey, and there was about 2 other tables that were empty. Izuku was playing referee for some sort of weird house rules the 3 of them were making up as they went. He heard them enter the air hockey section before he saw them, but when he turned back to take a glance at the new group of people who had entered the area, he was immediately reminded him of Kachin and his group of friends. There was about 3 of them, and they were still wearing their school uniforms. Izuku recognized them as being from Maridun. It was a public middle school that was actually rather high-ranked and had a sister high school in the area. The three boys seemed to be about third years, so about 14 or 15 by his reckoning. Izuku turned back around to focus back on the match between his friends when one of them called out, "Hey Moss Head. That's our table." Both Momo and Shoto stopped playing their game and looked at the newcomers. The buzzer on the game went off declaring the match over with Momo winning by 1 point, but Shoto paid the game no mind when he frowned. There are 2 other tables. Izuku could see Momo tensing right before he turned back to face the trio. They were a lot closer than before and were standing there in a way Izuku recognized as an attempt at intimidation. The boy in front sneered at Shoto and replied, "Yeah, they're all ours." The 2 boys flanking the one who spoke began chuckling. That was the moment Izuku realized that no matter what move they made, these guys were going to try to fight them. Putting on his best smile, Izuku scratched his head and laughed. "Wow, you must have a lot of friends to need this many tables. Shoto, Momo, we should just head out and maybe get some ice cream or something." Shoto nodded, his face showing approval, and Momo replied with a steady, "Yeah." The 3 of them grouped together as far as they could from the older boys, and Izuku was paying close attention to their responses. One had spiky hair, the other had purple hair, and the last one had eyes that were completely yellow, even the mascara. As they made their way out, they could hear the boys laughing, and what Izuku had not expected was for one of them to suddenly say, "Hey, wait, aren't you All Might's kid?" Without missing a beat, Momo had suddenly grabbed both of them by the hands and was running. When they hit the street, there was no way any of them were going to stop, as the boys who had kicked them out were suddenly chasing them, yelling, "Hey, wait, come back." Yellow Eyes, as Izuku was calling him in his head, was calling after them again. The 3 of them were booking it down the street with a group of older kids chasing them. They were doing their best to duck and weave through the crowded sidewalk, all while saying together. Shoto looked at him with wide eyes, and Izuku knew that they were going to be screwed if a hero heard the ruckus. Momo suddenly said, "There's a bus that should be at the corner about now. I saw it scheduled when I was looking for buses home." Izuku was now chanting "crap, crap, crap," because the bus wasn't there and they had almost reached the bus stop. So they ran on, and they could hear the other boys' shouts growing fainter and fainter just before Izuku grabbed Momo, who was on his left, and shoved Shoto, who was on his right, into a nearby store. The 3 of them fell in a pile on the entry mat before getting up and looking to see the cashier giving them dirty looks before scolding them. "You crazy kids. What do you think you're doing knocking about like that? What if you had broken a shelf, huh?" Shoto and Momo seemed frozen as the adrenaline pulsing through them was still going, and Izuku smiled as best he could and apologized for all of them. Once the cashier had stopped yelling, the 3 of them just looked at each other. Izuku started giggling like a fool, and Momo was laughing at how ridiculous the situation was. Shoto was smiling. The relief was palpable, and Shoto shook his head. Once everything had calmed down and those strangers were no longer a factor, Shoto spoke. "Well, I guess we're not going there for a while." Momo laughed, then frowned. "Oh my gosh, I can't believe that happened. This better not happen every time we go out." Izuku shook his head and looked at his phone. "It shouldn't. I mean, really? Who starts chasing someone they just kicked out of an arcade? Oh man, I need to get home." Shoto took a peek at the time and agreed. "Me too. My father will be home soon and I need to get there before him." They negotiated bus rides. It turned out Momo and Shoto had the same one but would have different stops. Izuku took his own. When he got home, Izuku plugged his phone in and showered before changing into pajamas. Looking at his phone one last time before going to bed, he saw a couple of new messages in the group chat. "Sho-chan, made it home safe before Dad. Sister thought I was in my room the whole night. She told me not to keep my uniform on for so long. Emo-chan, you are kidding, right? My parents took one look at me and asked where the fire was. Sho-chan, yes, I'm serious. Sho-chan, Izuku still has my blazer." Izuku laughed and replied, "Izuku, I'll get it dry cleaned. It's probably all wrinkled from all that running around." Sho-chan, you do that. Bring it to me on Monday. Izuku, yes, night you too. Sho-chan, good night. Emo-chan, good night. Izuku stared at the replies for a while and smiled to himself. The 3 of them would be okay. Probably. After that first time, and after spending at least a week convincing Shoto that they were never normally chased out in the streets like that, the three of them had done their best to hang out almost every Sunday. For Momo and Izuku it wasn't that hard since they'd already been doing that. For Shoto it apparently meant rescheduling his rest days. But he'd seemed adamant, and so he changed his normal Wednesday rest to Sunday and his Saturday rest just stayed the same. It was only a week or so until summer break and Izuku really wanted them all together at least one more time before the 40-day break that would consist of training overtime for all three of them. So going with his parents' own idea, one evening while they were all in the living room. His mother was reading a book and his father seemed to be looking through the nightly news when he asked, "Mom, Dad, do you think I could invite Shoto to the picnic with Yaoyorozu's that you've been planning?" The reaction was instant. His mother put her book down and his father sat up and turned completely towards him, news forgotten. Of course he was asking something completely ridiculous. The Yaoyorozus knew about his father's current condition. While Momo's parents had seen it happen slowly due to their agency's proximity to All Mights and the fact that they worked together often, Momo hadn't been told. He was keeping two really huge reality-altering secrets from her, and while one was not really his to tell, the other he couldn't because his parents kept saying it will be easier this way, and he had no idea what the hell that meant. Still, since Momo didn't know about his dad's condition, then that meant his father would have to be powered up for their picnics. The only real issue was the fact that Shoto was Endeavor's son and stepping into their house would be like a declaration of war. Or something. Really, it was the securest place Izuku could think of having their next friendly get-together. That was something that was difficult. Sure, they had their little spots they favored, but sometimes it was nice to do something new together. The situation being what it was a fairly difficult to find places they wouldn't be seen together. "Why do you want to invite him, Izuku?" His father asked not unkindly. Of course he was curious and he'd promised to support their friendship. "Well," he began, "I wanted us all to hang out before summer crunch time and I know we won't have a lot of time once summer starts." His mother nodded and clutched her book to her chest. "I understand. I would be nice to meet your friend too, won't it, Toshi?" The hero nodded. "Yes, it would. But Izuku, don't be too disappointed if he says no." Izuku nodded. "Of course." "Then sure, invite him, one more person won't hurt." Izuku. Announcement. Shochan has been invited to the annual summer Yagi Yaoyorozu picnic. Emma-chan, OH. That's so cool. I hope he can come. Izuku. If he can't it's fine, he'll get more invitations in the future. Shochan. Just read this. I hope I can attend, give me the date and I'll check my father's schedule. Izuku. OH. That's a nice emoji. He looks so happy. Emo-chan. Izuku. Emo-chan. Omega. Izuku. Shochan. What is happening? Izuku. We're just getting excited that you might come. Oh. Shochan. Emo-chan. You're really getting the hang of texting casually, Todoroki. Shochan. /_. Emo-chan. Really? Izuku. Aha. Shoto smirked at his phone. It was fun talking to them on the chat. It was getting a lot easier to communicate with them partially because they liked texting and having time to read then think about what he was going to say was a lot easier than having a verbal conversation where he'd get nervous and worried about social niceties he may be forgetting. That was another thing. In the chat there wasn't really any social structure. He'd never talked to his sister the way he talked to Yaoyorozu or Izuku when he was texting. Emojis were another thing he'd never used, but the thought that looked neat, so Izuku just told him, if you see one you like and think it looks how you feel, just use it. By looking at how his friends used them in chat and then adapting that with Izuku's advice. He was getting the hang of being more casual. He was more reserved than them still, but he didn't really think that would go away. They thought that was fine, that's why they liked him, so really it didn't matter if he never became outgoing and jolly. That was Izuku's role anyways. He had a harder time getting used to when Izuku or Yaoyorozu would just start talking about their day in the group chat without really caring which one of them answered. When he asked, Yaoyorozu just told him, "That's because I want to tell you both about my day. It's easier than sending the same messages in different chats to both of you." And Shoto supposed that made sense. So now he had to ask himself if he was willing to go to Izuku's house, meet his mother and All Might. Shoto's first reaction was, hell no, because that was asking for a lot of feelings that he'd already dealt with to make a comeback. But then, if he'd already dealt with them, they shouldn't be a problem. And really he wanted to meet the Yaoyorosis. Besides all that, this was the safest place they could possibly go. Since their first outing they'd been to a couple of out-of-the-way markets as well as some rural parks. They had also been to a couple of arcades in a very sparsely populated area and played air hockey. That was apparently approved of because it was only a block from where Izuku's grandpa lived. Shoto was grateful that Izuku had said he could say no. While the option was always available, it was nice to be reminded that he could just not go if he wanted. This time his attendance would depend on his father's schedule. It was unlikely he'd be able to go. In weeks leading up to summer break, training was already picking up for him in what Izuku and Yaoyorozu suitably called the summer crunch. The only way he'd make it was if his father decided to spend the day working. While that wasn't unusual for a Sunday, it was a tad unlikely at this time of the year. He was really digging himself into a hole here and he knew it. There was going to be a sign on his back soon that just said royally screwed, because at this point he'd made 2 friends he was sneaking about to see. Part of him wanted help at home, to let someone in on the secret, but really that would risk them taking the brunt of Endeavor's fury when he found out. And as horrible a person NG was, he'd never ever harm his perfect little masterpiece. If Shoto was the only one involved, then he was the only one who could be punished. Izuku and Momo couldn't be touched either because they were standing behind the one man in the world with more power than him. It soothed his soul to remember that. NG could not touch them. He'd fought himself constantly over this. He wanted to be a hero and surpass his shitty father, he wanted to have friends, and he had always been told those things were mutually exclusive. Shoto was still fighting. While he enjoyed the camaraderie and times he spent with Yaoyorozu and Izuku, he wondered if they would abandon him once they entered high school. All of them were shooting for Yue, all of them were capable. Would competition bleed out their friendship? But then, right now they were in competition anyways, weren't they? He and Izuku had spars and were actually tied for wins. Shoto was finally beating him at the ever-changing obstacle course that Night Eye would lay out for them, and while they were competing they both had a fierce need to win. When it was all over they would drink water and Izuku would compliment him or jokingly complain about how Shoto was catching up with him. While Shoto knew Izuku wouldn't abandon him, he thought they would have to talk about it eventually. After all, only one of them could be number one. Getting back to the task at hand, Shoto decided he'd play it by ear and message Izuku his yes or no as soon as he was sure of his schedule for the Sunday the picnic would be on. As it was a Wednesday, it made sense for him just to forget about the whole thing lest he worry over it before he needed to. It was Friday when he got his answer though. After a rather brutal workout courtesy of his father's personal hand in that day's training, he was cooling down with a bottle of water that had bit of sports drink in it when NG looked him up and down and said, "You've gotten a lot faster, Shoto." Remaining calm, Shoto continued his cool-down stretches. "I've been working on speed training." His father nodded and said, "Good. I'm going out this weekend. I'm spending both Saturday and Sunday searching for a serial killer in Kanagawa. Continue as if I were here." Shoto frowned and didn't answer. NG glanced at him and then continued his own stretches. As for Shoto, he finished up and went to shower and change, quickly shooting off a text that said, "Shochan. Announcement. I'll be able to go to the picnic. _" When he got to his phone again, the replies were, "Izukin. Inchan. Nabla." Every year since they were 9 their families had a picnic together. It originally started as the Yagis thanking her parents for helping out when All Might had been sick. At the first picnic there had been about a half-dozen other heroes, but the 2 years after that it was just them and the Yagis. Momo supposed it was because Izuku and she had become good friends, so their parents felt the need to try and get along. Fortunately, they didn't have to try very hard and they had dinner together every month or more. "Mom," Momo called out. They were both in the garden tending to their plants. It was funny, she hadn't been allowed to tend to them for years, and now her mother was taking the time to teach her to care for every plant in their garden. Her mother came over and smiled. "What seems to be the trouble?" Momo showed her a small bunch of weeds that were growing among the flowers. "I wanted to show you this. Did you want to burn them, or should I pull them out? The woman looked them over and seemed to contemplate the situation before nodding to herself. Do you think you could burn them by yourself, or should I help you out? While she was very enthusiastically learning to care for the plants she shook her head. Maybe next time. I'm not sure I have the technique down exactly yet. As they tended the weeds, her mother began asking, So how's school, Momo? You don't talk about it much. Momo thought if over, and while she was enjoying going, Solnia and everyone in her class was at least focusing on their future, no one shared the same dreams she did. It's good, I'm learning a lot and the classes are really constructive, was her reply. Her mom didn't seem too content with that though. Momo, it's already summer and you haven't made any new friends. Is everything okay? Not wanting to pout or seem immature, Momo held in her sigh. I don't get along with anyone well enough. They want me to go do things I don't like or talk about boys. The woman started laughing. Momo, you can't say that. I'm sure plenty of girls like going to the arcade and going to bookstores. I know it seems like you're alone, but trust me, there is someone who has a lot in common with you somewhere at that school. Momo frowned then. I'm sure they do. Ando and her friends go to the arcade all the time, but none of them really get me, Mom. None of them understand that my only free days are Saturdays and Sundays because I have to be able to make everything I possibly can before I turn. They don't get that I have to work out every day and go to bed early so my body can rest. Finally she sighed. If I tell them I'm busy and that Sundays I already have plans but Saturdays free most of the time, they look at me like I'm crazy. Not a single one of them has to manage their time like that. Do you dash? Her mother inhaled and looked like she was going to get misty-eyed. Do you resent it? Then Momo laughed. Of course not. I love it. Every day I'm one step closer to my dream of being a hero mom. I'm doing everything I want. I just want people who get that have to go through the same things. Yes, well, the woman smiled softly then as she finished burning out the last of the weeds. I guess I'll have to hold out for you getting into high school to have any slumber parties. She laughed again and shook her head. Yeah, I guess. It was hard on her. She didn't get to see her friends every day at school like Izuku and Shoto did. And for some godforsaken reason her mother thought that Izuku and Shoto couldn't properly fulfill her friendship needs, as if them being boys made them less relatable. Momo cleaned up after her gardening and went to do her homework. It was Friday, so she got dressed in her comfy jeans and a t-shirt and set up her webcam. Logging into her computer, she opened the door to her room so her parents could hear what she was up to. She checked her friends' statuses. They seemed to be online and already in a video call, so she checked her messages. Sure enough, Momo found an invitation to a conference call. Selecting accept, her laptop's screen filled with Todoroki and Izuku's faces. Welcome. Izuku chimed happily as Todoroki called a quiet, "Huh." Todoroki was wearing headphones and sitting at his desk, and Izuku was providing music via a small radio he kept in his room. This was what got her through really. She practically lived for her Sunday hangouts and video study sessions. And for now it would be enough. It would only be another 2 years. The best way Shoto could describe what was happening was that they were having an argument. He'd had to put his phone on silent because something rare happened and his sister was making him breakfast on a Saturday morning. His phone was going nuts, so he just placed it face down at his place at the table and decided he'd have to wash his hands of it for the time being. Shoto was eating when he finally took the time to catch up with what Yaoyorozu and Izuku were saying. Emo-chan, I really think that we should just call the chat group Hero Squad. Izuku, I say that's not a good name at all. How many kids do you think name their group chats that? All of them. Emo-chan, so it's like being All Might's son and wanting to be called Small Might. Izuku, I was 5. Okay, stop please. Get back to the point. We should call it like Alliance of 3-inch or something. Emo-chan, okay, the 3 is a good idea, but Alliance has to go. Sho-chan, why does the group chat need a name? Emo-chan, Izuku read an article on the internet about hero teams and want us to call ourselves something. Sho-chan, we're not a hero team. Are we? Izuku, no, but it'd be cool to have a name for the group chat at least. Sho-chan, so, another code name. Emo-chan, exactly. Sho-chan, I really don't mind either. I'm not really picky. Then he put his phone back down and ate his food because really it wasn't something he wanted to dispute. Fuyumi, his sister, eyed him a bit but he ignored her and just ate. When he finished he got up to wash his plate. Fuyumi was still eating and when he turned back around he saw her peeking at his phone's lock screen. Shoto felt like his blood was freezing and his heart had stopped. For some reason, his hand flew to his pocket even though he knew his phone wouldn't be there like he thought it had been when he'd cleaned his plate. Fuyumi put it down and looked at him, and she seemed every bit as nervous as he did. I was just going to check the time. But who are they? She asked shakily, all those messages. Shoto did his level best not to frown as he felt a bit of anger course through him. He couldn't lie that would be wrong but he wanted to crawl back to his room and spend the day there suddenly. He wanted a normal life, my friends. She looked like she was going to ask another question so he immediately snatched up his phone and took off toward the door saying, leave it, before he left. Really it was bound to happen. Fuyumi hadn't done anything wrong after all he'd never had anything to hide. She'd checked his phone for the time before without him complaining. Hell, he'd left his phone in the living room unattended for hours on end sometimes before everything had changed. But his brain was screaming sheet over and over. On the bus ride he opened the chat that was still going and sent. Shochan, my sister saw my phone alerts with your messages. Izuken, and seriously who uses the word triumvirate Momo? Izuken, crap. Do you think she'll tell your dad? Emo-chan, maybe you should talk to her? Shochan, if I talk to her she'll get in trouble when he finds out. I don't know if she'd tell him if I didn't say anything though. She just knows I have a friend and she won't see anything wrong with that. Emo-chan, I don't know Todoroki. Your judgment is really the best for this but if you need to you can just tell your dad about me. Shochan, thank you but unless he asks. I don't think I'll tell him. Izuken, whatever you think is best Shoto. We're going to stand with you okay? He was already feeling calmer, the death grip he had on his bag was loosened and he was breathing properly again. It would be. Sunday was really an ordeal. Endeavor had been gone since Saturday morning as promised and Fuyumi was watching him really closely. She'd been on his side of the house when he got home on Saturday and had even brought him some of the dinner she made that night. Things between them while formerly distant were now heavy with this thing. He didn't want to talk about it and make her think it was a big deal. He knew she was trying to get him to tell her about his friends. So Sunday he posted in the group chat, I might be late sorry. That met with surprise that he was still coming but he'd have this day with Izuku and Momo. Nothing would stop that because in his mind it may very well be the last in a while. Izuku spent the morning helping his mother in the kitchen, cleaning, and setting up the backyard for their little gathering. He couldn't help but think about everything that was happening. Momo, he knew, was feeling the loneliness more keenly than ever and he was doing his best to alleviate that as her friend but he also kind of felt like it was partly his fault. There wasn't really anyone to blame for that situation. He had no regrets choosing Deveron, especially now when it had brought Shoto to them. Shoto who seemed to be coming to a crossroad in his life. Izuku wouldn't claim to be an expert on the other boy's life, and he wasn't going to pry either. Not when he had his own secrets he was keeping. But that didn't mean he couldn't be worried. His father of course had noticed and asked, you seem more anxious than usual, is everything all right? Izuku ran through his current situation and tried to verbalize how he was feeling. It's just. Shoto is dealing with so much and Momo. She tries to hide it but I can tell she misses being able to see each other every day. We talk all the time but it's just so different now. I feel like I'm the only one who's really happy and I feel like being happy makes me a horrible friend. He could feel the tears burning in the corners of his eyes. It was just him and his dad right now and he might just start crying. His father reached towards him and suddenly chopped him on the top of the head causing Izuku to let out a shrill squeak. It's okay to be happy you silly boy. I'm sure your friends are too. You know you can be happy and hurting at the same time. What matters is that you don't let the hurt rule how you live. His father smiled and then hugged him tightly. Izuku sunk into the embrace and clung to his father like a child would. The hero continued speaking, you and your friends are all still growing up and that means that a lot is going to change. As long as you stick together you will make it out all right. Izuku nodded but didn't move from the embrace. He was already 13, but he still felt the safest when he was in one of his parents' arms. What if something goes wrong? What if we can't see Shoto anymore, or Momo gets so fed up with it all she stops talking to me? Do you hear yourself? Was the half-amused and half-concerned reply. What if this and what if that? None of that has happened, and if it does, if you really care about Todoroki, you'll pick up where you left off when you do see him again. As for Yaoyorozu, she's stuck with you this long. If she leaves, then she leaves. Like I said, life is change, and growing up is just change in extra amounts. Just breathe a bit, my boy, you'll be just fine. You'll see. They stayed there for a few moments, just until he felt all right again. When Shoto did arrive, it was a while after the Yaoyorozes had, but just before they were about to eat. He looked like he had the weight of the world on his shoulders, so Izuku did his best to just be his friend. Momo had brought his mother flowers for the garden, and while Mrs. Yaoyorozu explained to her how to plant them, Mr. Yaoyorozu talked to his father about current events and the newest support items they'd heard of. Izuku was able to grab his friends and pulled them to the place that was set up under the tree with a blanket. "I'll be right back," he promised with a smile as he left to get them all more drinks. Really, this was the best he could do when he really could do nothing. He was feeling a bit helpless and then tried to remind himself that sometimes you can't do anything. Sometimes it's up to someone else to do the fixing. Momo's loneliness wasn't something he could fix completely. Being her friend and talking to her all he could was the only course he could take. Izuku reminded himself that he couldn't pry into Shoto's life because he had his own secrets, and Shoto would have to feel safe enough to come to him first. When Izuku left, Momo shook her head and got comfortable under the shade of the Yagi's tree. "Is everything okay with you and your sister Todoroki?" Todoroki nodded. "It's as fine as it will be for now. I'm thinking this will be the last time we're all together for a while. Between the summer crunch and my family, it might be a bit touch and go." Momo nodded. Todoroki had an odd relationship with his siblings, and while Izuku knew more than her, he didn't really know much either. "How does he do it?" Todoroki suddenly spoke, gaze focused on where Izuku was getting them refreshments, and Momo tilted her head trying to puzzle out what he was asking. Luckily, Todoroki continued. "He has his father's quirk, so how doesn't he succumb to the weight it must carry?" Momo's eyes widened and she felt a wave of shock pour over her. Did Izuku tell you he had All Might's quirk?" Todoroki stopped to think, then shook his head. "No. I just assumed, I suppose. He doesn't talk about it, and All Might is very secretive as well. I figured he didn't want to talk about it because it wasn't just his secret to talk about. After all, it seems to be a mysterious power." Momo couldn't help but agree. "You're right, but he's never told me what his quirk is either. For a long time I thought he was quirkless, but he wouldn't be training to be a hero if he was." Her friend let out a long. She sighed as she thought about it. Todoroki wasn't someone she could reach very easily. He had more in common with Izuku after all. He spoke again. Perhaps it's the weight of it that keeps him from speaking. It may have just been her, but Todoroki looked so fragile in that moment Momo thought he might break if she breathed. The moment was broken as Izuku arrived, happily serving them. Her best friend got comfy and she continued in a similar vein. "We've never talked about your quirk either, you know. It must be your mom's, right?" Izuku made a face and she kind of started regretting the question. Fortunately, Todoroki was willing to answer. "I inherited both. Ice on my right and fire on my left." That was surprising to her. He normally just talked about the cold part. But if he and his dad didn't get along, Todoroki is going to have one of the coolest quirks at UA. Izuku laughed. "He'll be a strong rival for whoever's in his class." "I had always thought it would be you," Todoroki replied, and Izuku kind of froze, then just melted into a smile. "Okay, I'll be your rival, I guess. I mean, you can have more than one. But we're all aiming for the top, so I guess all three of us are rivals, really," Izuku chattered on. Todoroki seemed thoughtful and replied, "How would you feel if I beat you? What if I became the undisputed #1 hero? How would you feel?" Momo hadn't really thought of that. They were all aiming to be top heroes, but Izuku and Todoroki had loftier goals than just being a high-ranking hero. They both wanted to be the #1 of the new generation. She looked at Izuku intently. She was just as interested in his answer as Todoroki was. Izuku was no longer smiling. He gave them the most serious expression she had ever seen him wear when he said, "If you beat me then that means you're better. That means that we both gave it 100% and you came out on top. So I'll be proud of you and support you the best I could from my spot as number 2. After all, finally Izuku gave them a brilliant smile. Being a hero isn't about fame and glory. It's about doing your best to keep the people of the world safe, right? Well, she couldn't really argue with that, but Todoroki seemed to be staring Izuku down with an intensity she hadn't really expected. Suddenly a shrill ringing filled the silence that had come over them. Todoroki quickly pulled out his phone and answered. Momo's stomach dropped when his face suddenly became ashen and he told the person on the other side, "I'll be right there as soon as I can," and hung up. Sparing a glance towards Izuku, she found he looked just as worried as her. Todoroki stood and announced, "I have to go home right now. My father just got home early and is asking for me." With that he said the quickest goodbyes he could and was gone. A cold fear settled over the two that were left behind. Izuku looked toward his parents who were looking back to him, and Momo suddenly felt like everything was about to change. From a very young age, Shoto had been encouraged to make friends of a sort. Almost every year his father would encourage him to forge connections with people who had quirks that could support his in the hopes of forging bonds. Shoto always understood those bonds would exist to propel him forwards towards his father's goals. That was, the people he'd meet would prop him up as a leader of sorts, and Shoto would be capable of using them as resources in the future. None of the people Shoto had met were ever to actually be his friends. His own standoffish nature led to him never actually forging any bonds at all. According to Endeavor, that was okay. Shoto wouldn't really need anyone until much farther in the future anyways. And then Shoto had met Yagyo Izuku. Through Izuku he'd met Yaoyorozu, and finally he'd forged bonds. But not the kind his father had wanted him to forge. Yes, Yaoyorozu had heroes for parents, but they were top 40s, not top 10s. Izuku's case was a bag of bad and horrible wrapped up in a blanket of awful. While he was the son of a top hero, that hero was All Might, and technically Shoto had been encouraged to actively seek out and destroy the boy at his earliest convenience. So he'd kept it a secret. If it was just Yaoyorozu, Enji would maybe roll his eyes at his friendship with her and then just let it be. But Izuku was the one who introduced them. And Endeavor wasn't a stupid man. He would recognize Yaoyorozu as Izuku's friend from those stupid articles about All Might's son's childhood sweetheart, or whatever crap they published. So as he rode the train home, he could feel the tension in his body slowly increasing. He'd received about 4 texts from his friends hoping that he was okay. Shoto wouldn't reply until it was over. According to his conversation with Fuyumi when he was at the Yagi's house, she wasn't as discreet as Shoto had given her credit for. She'd told Enji that Shoto wasn't home and had actually been spending the weekends out, most likely with friends from school. That meant Enji was going to ask him about who it was and why he wasn't doing his workouts on Sundays anymore. This was easily going to turn into an explosion. All of Shoto's anger was going to boil over. Of course he wasn't stupid, so there was an undercurrent of fear. He was about to throw himself against a door and barrel into completely uncharted territory. There was a healthy amount of fear. But still, when he arrived home, the tension that had been building encompassed his entire body. The anger he was feeling towards his father was no longer limited to this instance, but had linked itself back to every moment that he could remember that Enji had wronged his family. He'd practically stalked into the house prepared for everything to finally come to the climax it had been building to for years. Enji was standing in his living room looking a bit put out. Fuyumi was sitting on the couch and seemed rather nervous. Shoto was surprised to see her but not fazed. "Shoto!" Endeavor frowned at him. "Why are you out today? I have an entire training unit posted for you." Shoto inhaled and felt his throat burn. Part of him was grateful they were starting with that question. When he spoke, he was still in the entryway and was staring at the floor. "Sunday is my rest day. I've been doing the Sunday units on Wednesday for months now." He heard as Fumi inhaled sharply. Endeavor seemed to tense and his frown grew deeper. "And why have you moved it? Why did you not tell me you did so?" Shoto kept his breathing steady and tried not to let the fire he was feeling in his veins control his tone. "This was it. I've opened up Sunday to spend with my fiends, and I didn't think I should bother you with such a trivial change." It was partially true. There were more reasons. One's endeavor was about to learn anyways. The man scoffed. Your training takes precedence over any silly friends you've made. And Fuyimi says you haven't been coming home until the evening on Fridays. She says you come home and eat and you don't work out then either. Are you effing around because of some worthless little friends? Suddenly all the fire in his blood became so hot it felt freezing. Finally he looked up, but not at his father. Fuyimi was staring right back at him. The fear and sadness in her eyes was palpable. Shoto hadn't thought she'd noticed. He'd thought that she didn't pay much attention to him. Because of that he hadn't considered that Endeavor would be learning about how he spent his Fridays ever. A small piece of him was angry at his sister, but he understood. Fuyimi had to divulge anything she could to their father. After all, she didn't have the insurance he did of being his precious creation. Shoto didn't bother looking at Enji and kept his focus on Fumi. I spend Fridays at the gym with my friend from school. So you skip your Friday plan altogether? You ungrateful child. Enji finally began putting some conviction into his voice. You think I pore over your training just to have you throw it away? Some sort of wall broke then, the one holding back all the rage and bitter fury he had been pushing down since he was in his blind fury. He looked directly into Endeavor's eyes and screamed, All Might personally makes those schedules for me and Izuku. Those sessions are the reason I've gotten so much faster these past few months. In his peripheral vision he could see Fuyumi cringing back in horror. She was looking exactly how he was feeling at the moment. Enji, the smart man that he was, put the pieces together and the amount of rage beginning to pour off of him was suffocating. You've started playing nice with All Might Spawn then. I'd heard it might go to that school, but for you to actually forsake everything we've worked for. Shoto screamed again, the anger returning in full force. It's everything you've worked for. I'll never use my left side. I hate it. I hate pretending to care about everything you tell me to do. I hate you. Then his father did something Shoto would never forget. He'd watched in utter shock, frozen in fear as his father rushed towards him, reached out, and grabbed his right arm in utter fury. The man's grip was bruising and suddenly Shoto's brain was screaming at him to run. Shoto could hear Fuyumi screaming, but it was almost as if he was underwater. Everything was muffled, and suddenly his body acted of its own accord and was freezing. He froze his entire right arm and was starting to freeze his father's hand. It all happened so fast that, when Endeavor finally seemed to realize what was going on and released him, the hero's entire hand and forearm were frozen with steam beginning to rise from it. Suddenly free, Shoto ran. He ran out the door as far as he could down his block until he reached a bus stop that was letting off passengers. Boarding it, he settled into the back of the bus. The blur of adrenaline wore off and he finally came to himself about 2 blocks from his neighborhood. The boy curled up into himself on the bus bench and began weeping silently. His phone suddenly chirped, and if it hadn't been the group chat's jingle he'd have ignored it. Opening his phone he wiped his eyes and peeked at what it said. Izuku, just me and Momo sending some more hope that everything is okay. Shoto began weeping again, and before he could think he looked at the bus route and began typing. Shochan, I need you guys. Please. Then he sent the address of an ice cream shop he knew was nearby. When he got in the vicinity of the shop he disembarked and walked down the block towards it. After he'd settled in the very secluded corner of a booth, Shoto looked at his phone, feeling a bit stupid because there was no way they would come. It was late and almost past curfew. They wouldn't. Izuku, Momo and I are boarding a bus with Mai. Curfew won't be a problem if she's there. We'll be there real quick. Since he was in a booth, he felt comfortable enough in his privacy to cry just a little bit more. Shoto didn't feel like he had waited an hour, but according to the clock in the small ice cream parlor he was inhabiting that was correct. He would have looked at his phone, but around 15 minutes into his stay it began chirping with texts from his sister, so he turned it off. Izuku and Yaoyorozu arrived with Mrs. Yagi a whole hour after he'd asked them. Inko was sitting in the booth on the other side of the parlor snacking on some French fries, because apparently they sold American-style burgers there too, and she had gotten all 3 of them a small ice cream. So the 3 of them sat in the booth and Yaoyorozu and Izuku were chatting like he hadn't run out on them and then suddenly summoned them to an ice cream shop past curfew. It was all becoming a bit surreal that he had friends like that after everything that had just happened. He's organizing his thoughts and considering what he was even thinking calling them here. When finally he decides that he's not going to waste their presence. Do you two know what quirk marriages are? Both of them stopped and nodded. Izuku vocalized a yes, so Shoto continued. My father has a violent ambition to rise in the world. So he set out to defeat All Might rather early in his life. When he realized he would be stuck at number 2, he practically bought my mother from her family for her ice quirk. Yaoyorozu looked like she was going to be sick, but Izuku was wearing a rather fierce expression on his face. Shoto sighed and looked at his hands that were resting on the table. He watched the beads of condensation drip down the sides of his cup of ice cream. In all of my memories of my mother, she's crying. She called my left side hideous before she poured boiling water on my face. She's in a mental hospital now because of it. Yaoyorozu seemed like she was going to cry and clenched her hands into fists. As for Izuku, his face was now completely unreadable. A part of Shoto felt like a great weight had been lifted off his shoulders. My father would never hurt me. He views me as a valuable masterpiece that will one day overthrow All Might and his decedents. But today when we argued, he was so angry I was scared. I ran out. I told him I hated him, and I told him I hated my left side. I'll never use it. Finally Izuku spoke. Do you? Shoto stopped and looked at his friend. There was no judgment in his eyes. He was just trying to understand. Yaoyorozu looked surprised at the question. Shoto sighed. Yes. Izuku nodded once and then smiled a small comforting smile. Sho-chan, I have a lot to say, but right now, the words you need to hear are, no matter what happens, we'll be here for you. We'll stand by your side. And support you with all we have. I'm sure my dad would be proud to help you if you need it. Those words, they brought a bit of fear to his heart with how strong the conviction behind them were. Shoto nodded then and said, Thank you. Shoto. Momo began. She seemed reluctant. The name was strange on her tongue, and Shoto felt rather flustered that she'd use his given name, but they were friends and he just bared himself to her. It was more than appropriate. Has your father ever done anything that actually made you feel unsafe? Or is it just his anger that scared you? That was a smart question. Shoto gave her credit for that, but Enji would never hurt him, as he'd already said, and he wasn't willing to divulge the shame his father had brought upon his mother by beating her, then just hiding her away once he had broken her. No. Like I said, he'd never hurt me. Yaoyorozu nodded and Shoto continued. Thank you for your concern. Momo. She blushed a bit at the informality of it all, and Shoto thought it felt a bit strange to call a girl by her first name. Bust shrugged it off. Do you think your mom can ride home with me? Shoto sighed. It was past curfew and he really shouldn't be riding without an adult. The fact he was asking to borrow Izuku's mom was rather silly, since then Izuku and Momo wouldn't have anyone to ride home with. Hold on a moment. Izuku smiled one of his brightest shining smiles and went to speak to his mother. Momo then turned to him and again began talking. You can call me Emo-chan, you know. We're friends and all. Maybe in the chat first, Shoto replied. That was a bit too much of a leap for him right now. Momo nodded and said, okay, in the chat first. Inko and Toshinori had a suspicion that everything wasn't as happy as the Todoroki family liked to pretend it was in front of the lights and cameras of the media. Of course, no family was perfect, but they believed something was deeply wrong the first time Izuku told them that Shoto had been keeping their friendship as secret not only from Endeavor but his siblings as well. While both of them were only children, the fact that Shoto was the youngest of 4 and wasn't close enough with any of his siblings to be comfortable telling them about his friends was strange. Night Eye hadn't offered up any concerns though, so they had just hoped Izuku would come to them if something happened. Now though, she knew something was wrong. What with the way the boy had run from their picnic only to practically plea for his friends to come to him in such a strange place past curfew. Inko only hoped that Izuku would tell her if anything truly happened. She kept an eye on the 3 children. She'd promised the Yaoyorozes to get Momo home, and now that she was thinking about it, it looked like she'd need to call Toshi to get Izuku so she could take both Momo and Shoto home, because if he wasn't comfortable telling his siblings his secrets, he probably wouldn't think to call them for a ride. The entire situation made her tired. She knew if she didn't have Toshi's support these past couple years, she'd have thrown in the towel ages ago. Now with Izuku's natural empathy, he'd of course set to saving someone before he was even a hero. Inko was so proud of her boy, but she also worried about where this was headed. Would Endeavor accuse them of turning his son against him? She didn't know the man well enough to even begin thinking of his possible responses to the situation they had found themselves in. She munched on her serving of fries a bit more. Really, their family was ridiculous, and of course it is. But she always knew it would be. She had made the choice to fall for that strange and bright boy on the bus in a UA uniform instead of that neighborhood boy all those years ago. Inko had always hoped Izuku would take after her more, and he had, but he'd taken after his father equally, and while it wasn't a problem, he was really the best of them both. It still gave the both of them heart attacks whenever he decided to do something particularly reckless. They'd live, of course, he was their son through and through. More like his father than you'd expect by looking at him, quirkless and all. Suddenly Izuku was bounding over to her with a great big hello smile on his face, and she wanted to sigh again because he looked so much like his father when he was about to do something foolish, and she'd had enough drama for the day. Shochan wants to know if you can ride home with him. But I think we both should. Really, she'd expected worse. She'd actually expected Shoto to have to come home with them and a long night of phone calls. But she'd also considered what he was suggesting already. What about Momo? Tomorrow is a school day. Izuku seemed thoughtful, then smiled again before saying all in one breath. Emo-chan lives in the same direction. So if we all ride together it should be fine. I just don't want you or Momo riding home alone, and Dad's time limit is probably up for the day, so he can't come get anyone but me. But you need me to ride home with you just in case there's a creep on the bus. Besides, it's better this way because if we're all together everyone is safe and Dad won't have to come get me and take up even more time. Really, Inko was grateful that her son no longer muttered a mess unless he was thinking to himself and lost in thought, but the amount of explaining in a short PRD he was now capable of was nothing short of amazing. I suppose, she replied as she thought it over, I was already thinking about how I was going to get all of you home, and that's a great solution. Izuku smiled again and then kissed her on the cheek before bounding back towards his friends. Really, that boy was too much like his father. When Shoto finally arrived home, Fuyumi was in his living area again. This time she was crying. Immediately he felt a little guilty that he'd turned his phone off and forgotten about her. Shoto, where have you been? She cried, standing immediately coming towards him. I had no idea where you were or what to do. Shoto didn't frown nor did he smile. I just needed to clear my head. Does he want to see me? His sister shook her head, still angry. He didn't say anything after you left. He went out for a bit and only came home half an hour ago, just to lock himself in his room. Sighing, he nodded, good, and went to his room with Fuyumi calling after him again. He really didn't feel like talking about anything with her. After what happened earlier, any trust he may have had in her was completely gone. Suddenly an idea came into his mind and he turned on his phone and did a quick internet search to figure out how to do what he'd thought of. Opening the group chat, he changed the chat name and went to bed. In the morning he did as he did every Monday. Shoto got dressed for school and went to eat breakfast only to find Enji at the table. Normally his father was already out doing his rounds, so Shoto's brain was already gearing up for round 2. Deciding quickly that he should just avoid the entire thing as best he could, Shoto grabbed a piece of bread and began toasting it. Quickly he took out a pan to make an egg to throw on top and ignored his father altogether. Of course Enji was home still for a reason. I thought about what happened yesterday and I realized I had forgotten how old you were. Shoto did his best to ignore the man, but really he was right there, and the tone of voice he was using would have almost sounded apologetic if he wasn't such an a-hole. When I realized that, I understood. Your mind is probably a mess and can't see that the path I have given you is the best one. A little bit of teenage rebellion is really normal, but Shoto, you must know you're being foolish. You are no fool and you must realize that your feelings are just a passing result of your age. The toaster dinged and Shoto grabbed it with his left hand and placed the egg on top with a bud of spinach. His feelings were overflowing now and he had to get away. Quickly he grabbed his bag and made for the door. Endeavor just continued, so I'll let you have your little tantrum, do whatever you want. But when you realize that All Might Spawn is just as big a fool as his father and that the path I have made for you is the best one, I have no doubt you will return to me. Shoto froze for a moment, then turned to face his father. You're wrong and I'll prove it. Then left the man sitting there in the kitchen. Izuku woke up from the long night more exhausted than he'd thought he would be. But he had promised his dad that he would get up for school the next day if he was allowed to go help Shoto. Momo was probably feeling their late-night talk as well about now. He looked at his phone for the time and saw he had a message in the chat from Momo. Emo-chan, did you change the chat name Izukin? It's cute. For all heart suit. Izuku took a glance at the chat's title and smiled. A sense of warmth filled him when he saw it. Izukin, nope. But I think it's perfect, Sho-chan. There was no reply forthcoming, but Shoto would see it eventually. Getting dressed tiredly, he went to breakfast with his parents. Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays were the only days the three of them ate together. Every other day of the week, All Might started patrol early. His mother made breakfast on those days. The rest of the week he had leftovers from dinner in the morning or made himself something quick. His dad was reading the newspaper as always and smiled when he greeted him. You look good for having had such a late night. Izuku smiled back. I learned from the best after all. His father smiled brighter when Izuku continued, Sir Knight, causing the man to laugh and spit up a bit of blood into his handkerchief. Which would be gross if Izuku wasn't already desensitized to it all. Inko scolded them from her place in front of the stove. You're going to have a fit, Toshi. Please both of you calm down, it's too early for me to be worrying. Both of them chuckled a small apology. When breakfast was almost done cooking, Izuku helped his father set the table and his mother served them both. Giving her husband a quick kiss and her son a peck on the head. How did it all go last night? Your mother told me some, but I'm sure you probably know more. His father asked as they began to eat their soup. Izuku and his mom had rice and eggs as well, but the hero was restricted to liquids for now. Sho-chan had a fight with his father and bolted. I mean some of the things he told me were awful, but none of it was anything that could be considered more than just a bad relationship with his father. I had thought his dad was. Anyways, I don't think he'd want me sharing it. His father nodded sagely. If Shoto hasn't told you anything too serious, then you really can't do much except be there for him. Izuku nodded in agreement. After all, it's not like they could send Endeavor to jail for being a shitty dad. Besides, the only illegal thing he had been told had already been dealt with. Izuku really hoped that Mrs. Todoroki was getting the help she needed. I already promised him that. I even promised him that I'd support him when he became the #1 hero. At that his father sputtered his soup a little in surprise. Have you already given up Izuku? Shaking his head he laughed. No way. It's just, I've sparred with him for months and we're equals. If we were to compare our strengths when we aren't limited by the laws restricting people without a hero license, I'd put myself way below him. I still want to be a hero. And it would be nice if I could be #1 like you. Suddenly the weight of speaking the words aloud were hitting him. He'd kind of been thinking about it in the back of his mind ever since he realized Shoto was his equal in most things and superior in a few others. Izuku was better at a few things than the other boy and he'd taken pride in those. But Shoto had an amazing quirk, one that was far better and more powerful than even Kachan's, and that made him start shoving all the thoughts he was having about his future down into a pit that was now starting to overflow as they talked at the breakfast table. Suddenly, he felt like he was going to cry like he hadn't cried since he was 9. I'm quirkless, Papa. How can I even hope to stand on the same starting line as him? He could hear his mother crying too, and damn it, he didn't want that. He didn't want her crying any more tears for him. Suddenly his father's thin arms were around him and he was saying, You can and will be a hero. Never doubt it, you have the drive to be #1 as long as you want it. Izuku nodded, but I don't have the ability. I don't. I know better than anyone else what it takes. Trust me. Before next spring is over you will have everything you need. When Izuku got to school he was shaking off his emotional outburst and was pretty surprised to find Shoto sitting by the gates. So gearing up for a talk he made his way to the other boy and sat next to him. How was your morning, Sho-chan? Shoto hadn't reacted to his appearance or approach but suddenly turned to him. Izuku felt his heart seize and begin breaking into a million pieces. There were tears in Shoto's eyes and his voice shook when he said, He talked to me this morning like it was nothing. Like my feelings weren't real and I was crazy for feeling the way I do. He acted like I was just being unreasonable. Shoto suddenly leaned forward, curling into himself, and Izuku put a hand on his shoulder. The other boy shook and Izuku could hear him sobbing. He looked around and nobody was watching. The bench they occupied was in a small alcove and Izuku wouldn't have it if anyone intruded or took notice of them. My feelings were nothing to him. He called it a tantrum. Shoto sobbed. His own emotional state only just recovered. Izuku had to pull together before he said, "Sho-chan, I am so sorry but we're in front of the school. Someone might see us." Shoto pulled himself together and straightened his posture. Izuku grabbed his arm to make sure he hadn't taken it wrong. "Let's go to the bathroom and talk, okay?" The other boy nodded and wiped his tears. Izuku was starting to get over the shock of the level Shoto had broken down. To be brushed off after an intense argument was a feeling Izuku had only ever felt with Kacchan, and if his own father ever did it, Izuku would think he'd been replaced by some shape-shifting villain. Quickly the two boys went to the bathroom on the closest bathroom. By the time they reached it, Shoto seemed more put together. Entering, Shoto had finally spoke. "I'm sorry, Izuku. I was so shocked that seeing you made it all come out." Izuku did his best to offer a comforting smile as Shoto washed his face and dabbed at his red eyes. "It was 100% perfectly okay, Sho-chan. The only reason I stopped you was where we were. Never feel bad for how you feel. That's what my mom says at least." Izuku smiled. "I'm here to cry on all the time. As long as you return the favor, of course." That made Shoto chuckle. "Yes, I suppose. I've only ever cried about this sort of thing when I was smaller." Izuku nodded. "I used to be bullied before I moved to Tokyo when it took about a year before I cried about it and not blamed myself. Night Eye says that's because I didn't feel safe enough emotionally until I was permanently away from it all." Shoto stared at him as if he'd said his father wasn't actually all might and his quirk was that he could remove his own head. "You were bullied?" Izuku chuckled a bit. "Yeah, I was a nervous wreck as a kid. Ask Momo about it sometime. I didn't have a lot of self-confidence. Anyways, this is about you. You crying is natural and I'm happy if you feel safe enough with me to cry." Shoto nodded and looked as put together as he was going to get. "My father said I could do whatever I want because being your friend is just me rebelling against the path he made for me, or something." Izuku froze, disbelief filling his mind, causing him to just stare at the other boy. "You mean he called me a way to rebel against him? That's a bit self-centered." Shoto shrugged. "He's always been that way. He thinks I'm going to be Endeavor 2.0". Izuku frowned at that and wished he could say something that would make it all go away, but he didn't have his father's quirk and didn't have those kind of hopes riding on his shoulders. He could remember the day Recovery Girl told him he was quirkless and his mother cried for his dying dreams but assured him that they always knew it could happen, never explaining how. He had a foggy memory of his father coming into his room late one night after the diagnosis when Izuku was supposed to be in bed. He had pretended that he hadn't been woken by the noise and his father had whispered ever so quietly something that sounded like, "This is all my fault." Izuku was half convinced he dreamed it. But the point stood. He had no idea how Shoto felt at all and it made him feel helpless. So he did the only thing he could do. "Well, you're not him. You're Shoto and you're going to be my best friend who I support no matter what." Shoto looked at him and something in the other boy's face changed. "Me too. I'll support you too." Izuku nodded and smiled. Shoto really had it right when he called their chat Trust Trio. Shoto was pretty embarrassed about the whole crying on his friend thing. Really, he understood that it was okay to Izuku, but for him it was practically mortifying. He had genuinely thought himself all right. That he could and had dealt with the brush-off his father had given him after such an emotionally charged situation. But then again, he just felt really numb after that entire conversation with Endeavor, and seeing Izuku just made it all overflow. On some level it was nice to have someone outside of it all he could vent to, and Izuku was apparently a good person to approach. It was just another strange thing to add to the, "I guess that's what friends do" pile. The entire day Izuku was a reassuring presence, and it made Shoto secure in the promises they had all made the night before. When the day was done, Izuku said his goodbyes and promised he'd be on call if Shoto should need him again. Shoto really had no idea what things would be like at home. Would Enji really continue acting like he had that morning? Would he actually explode again like Shoto was expecting? He steeled himself and gathered up his wits on the bus ride home. As usual, no one was on his side of the compound when he got there. It was kind of strange though, since for the past few days someone had been there. And since he was still expecting a horrible backlash from the night before, it was even stranger. Shoto changed into his gym clothes and went to their weight room and saw that Endeavor has posted a brand new workout for Monday to fit in with the start of his summer crunch. He was beginning to feel like the night before was a fever dream and he'd made it all up. But Izuku had remembered. And the texts were still there when he'd asked for his friends. He finished his workout and cleaned up and began to prepare himself dinner. The rice was cooking and he'd popped a plum in for flavor. He was steaming some chicken and vegetables when he received a text from his father that just said, "No more Friday units." And that was it. Shoto wanted to scream suddenly, maybe throw the pan he was cooking with through a wall or something, because nothing was making any sense to him at all. Why would his father have a screaming match with him, then just act like everything was fine and him training with Izuku was 100% okay? Clenching his fists, he'd almost forgot about the food he was preparing. Quickly he went to the pan but was beginning to feel numb all over again. Enji had to be letting him settle. He had to be lulling him into a sense of security before coming down on him for everything, right? Shoto was trying to figure out what his father was planning. He was probably waiting for summer, when he wasn't seeing Izuku every day. Enji was waiting for break to come, then Shoto's real hell would begin, right? He was feeling confident now. That's what was happening. They had paused because if Enji did something drastic now, Izuku would know, and if Izuku knew, then All Might knew. That was it. Except when the week ended and summer break came, it was just like last summer, and Shoto was beginning to feel like he'd imagined all the rage from that night. It happens a few more times. He'll argue with his father about the future and his decision not to use his left half, and Enji will explode but then leave the room or the entire house. When he comes home, he acts like the argument didn't end with Shoto screaming that he'd never use his father's shitty quirk and Endeavor's flames flaring up. Enji always acts like they just had a disagreement over tea while talking about the weather, and it's starting to F with his head. So after every fight he begins a new ritual. He opens up the Trust Trio chat and messages his friends that he and his father had fought again. He tells them exactly how bad it was right after it's happened. This grounds him, and it helps him know that there are at least 2 other people in the world that are there for him. It also serves as a reassurance that, yes, their fights are actual shouting matches sometimes. That there are 2 people that are not him that also believe that his fights with Enji are getting worse. It keeps him sane. It's already winter again when Shoto finally is secure in the fact that Enji is never actually going to stop him from meeting with his friends. He'll be turning 14 in a few weeks, and their first year of middle school is almost over when he decides that he should be the one to take his friends somewhere that the media might see them. They'd of course been careful up until now, but Shoto partially wanted to test how far he could go before Endeavor actually did something, and the other part of him was just tired of sneaking around like he and his friends were criminals. It was late December, and with January approaching along with winter break, there would be a brief window of time that they will all be on break before their final terms, and the first cherry blossoms of the year would be blooming. Cherry blossom viewing would be simple, traditional, and it would be a bonus to make up for the picnic he had been forced to leave earlier in the year. It would be a little different since there would be more people there for the viewing and there would be a festival going on, but a day out together eating at the booths that would be set up and just enjoying the festival would be something fun. When he proposed the plan in the chat, Momo and Izuku seemed so excited he wanted to shove his head under a pillow with how embarrassed he was with the praise they were sending his way. Momo parents were rather quick to give the go-ahead for the excursion. Izuku, on the other hand, had taken a few weeks before getting the okay. All in all, the date was set. Their trio would embark to the Hanami during winter break in January right before his birthday. He told his father nothing. They would be going on a Saturday, so Endeavor wouldn't even ask. Besides, the Yagis and Yayaroses knew where they would be going, and really to Shoto that was enough insurance. On the morning of the trip he felt a thrill coming over him. Momo and Izuku had already caught on to his intent when he decided they all should go to somewhere as public as OE of the first few Hanami of the year. However, it was still surprising to arrive at the train station where they had agreed to meet, only to find Izuku in a hooded sweater that looked like All Might's hero costume, complete with the hair things sticking up off the hood. Shoto took one look at Izuku and pressed his lips together to prevent himself from laughing. No doubt it was a sight, because Momo was starting to laugh at whatever his expression looked like. I told him he looked ridiculous. She was covering her face now and turning red. Shoto, stop making that face, I only just stopped laughing. Izuku's indignant response was, it's not ridiculous, Momo. They wouldn't sell them if people didn't buy them. Izuku, I'm sure it's completely different for a fan to buy and wear that than it is for you. Shoto responded, finally pulling himself together. His voice was still strained and his face was still a bit red from holding in his laughter, but all in all he was returning to normal. See? Momo cried in triumph. Shoto agrees with me. Izuku frowned in the exaggerated way that always made Momo laugh. Well, you can both be wrong together. Now let's go. Suddenly he was bounding towards the platform and Momo shook her head. Come on, we can't lose, Small Might, or his parents might never let him out of the house again. Shoto shook his head. Do you really think we can lose him while he's wearing that? Momo just laughed again as they both followed their friend. Really, Shoto would never be used to Izuku's strange habits and ideas. He'd never really understand the admiration and love Izuku had for All Might as a dad. Shoto admired the man as an excellent hero. Still, he couldn't imagine getting along with his father enough to wear things as boldly as Izuku did. Sitting on the train to the Hanami, the three of them chatted and Shoto found out that the hoodie was actually brand new. He had gotten it along with a jogging suit that also looked like All Might's hero costume. Momo began telling them about how she was learning to create insulated fabric. Not much had really changed with him, so he just listened to his friends talk and joke and smiled when they said something that amused him. Finally they arrived to their destination and there was a hum of excitement in the air between the trio. Together they all made their way out of the train station and towards the park, determined to find a nice booth to eat their first meal. Izuku suddenly bolted away from them shouting, Taiyaki, stand dead ahead. Used to this sort of thing, Momo and Shoto were after him instantly. It wasn't as if Izuku was running full tilt either, it was more of a brisk walk, so speeding up to catch him wasn't that large of a task. Still, Momo was rolling her eyes. Izuku, seriously, that's the second time you've run off. We can't have taiyaki for breakfast anyways. Izuku turned to look at them and with a strange smile said, we're playing taiyaki roulette before the day is over, Emo-chan. She just smiled in return, fine, but not for breakfast. Shoto suddenly had a craving. Maybe we should start off with some ramen or soba? As always, Sho-chan is a genius. Izuku smiled happily. To the noodle shops. Again they trudged searching for suitable booth. There were so many people they had to slow down to make sure they wouldn't lose one another. Finally they reached a booth that served what Momo had deemed appropriate food and settled in. Izuku got not only plate of hot soba, but 2 servings of takoyaki. Shoto got a plate of cold soba and Momo bought herself serving of care pan. After buying their food, Momo stuffed her purse into Izuku's backpack at his urging, and they sat at one of the tables that was set up in the park. All around them were families playing different games at all the booths, and some children were playing their games of tag or whatever games they played with ball in the park. Shoto soaked in the atmosphere when suddenly Izuku declared, I'm going to go back and get some dumplings, anyone want anything? Momo shook her head, but Shoto decided he could do with some and nodded, get me some too. Izuku grabbed a few bills from his wallet in the backpack and ran off to the dumpling booth that was just across a small patch of grass from where they had decided to sit. He's going to get full really quick if he keeps eating so much. Shoto mused. Momo snorted, I forgot. You've never been to a festival with us. I promise you he will be eating all day. Every year he comes to the Girls' Day festival with me and my family, and every year he's eating the entire day, even on the train or bus ride home. Shoto was actually pretty surprised by that, though thinking on it he shouldn't be. Izuku had grown a lot in the past few months and he wasn't growing upwards either. He'd started getting a lot of bulk and muscle really quickly, and it must take a lot of calories to sustain that. This just added to Shoto's theory that Izuku had All Might's quirk. People with augmented strength bulked up a lot when PBRDY started up as they gained the mass they needed to sustain their quirk on a large scale. Before he could say as much, Izuku returned suddenly and plopped a single serving of dumplings in front of him and was eating a chicken skewer and announcing, "Emo-chan, you have to get on my shoulders and play chicken with me." Really, she should have expected it. Izuku was always enthusiastic about festivals and games, and Inko was always talking him out of doing the more physical games. Now Mrs. Yagi wasn't here, and the only thing standing between him and a risky game was apparently a willing partner. "Izuku, what on earth are you talking about?" She sighed, ready for whatever he was about to say. "Over by the walking area they have this huge air mattress thing and people are playing chicken on it," he enthused, and that really didn't answer her question. "What's chicken?" Shoto supplied, and she looked at him gratefully and he just nodded in acknowledgement of her thanks. Izuku had stars in his eyes. It's like a two-person cavalry battle. One gets on the other's shoulders and they have to knock the other team over. That sounds kind of dangerous. Shoto was sounding a bit skeptical about the idea that people actually played such a game, and Momo couldn't help but agree. Really? Shoto was going to be her new best friend and Izuku was going to have to deal with it. Izuku smiled reassuringly, and that didn't really help his case. It's not like he dragged her into dangerous situations regularly, but he only ever used that smile after he said things like, "Momo, let's go get some ice cream even though it's not our junk food day," and that meant he knew she was going to say no but wanted to try anyways. "Izuku, seriously, why do you want to play chicken?" she asked. He wasn't one to force her into anything, but she wanted an answer before she made a decision. Izuku looked thoughtful for a moment, then smiled again. "It just looks really fun, and I think we could win. I mean, I think I'll be a pretty sturdy base, and since you're probably lighter than Sho-chan, you'll be easier to balance. Besides, the people currently there just took down like 4 teams and we could totally beat them." It really didn't sound safe at all. "I don't know." Suddenly he smiled so brightly it made her want to smile back. "It's okay if you don't want to, Mo-chan, seriously. I just thought it looked fun. I'll do it." Both of them suddenly turned to Shoto, who had suddenly made the bold declaration after saying it sounded unsafe just a moment earlier. "I have more upper body strength, and while Momo, as a girl, has a better center of gravity, I'm pretty sure I can compensate for being top-heavy." Shoto spoke evenly with immense surety, but there was a look in his eyes that made Momo groan. Of course, hearing that a team had taken out 4 others made Shoto want to try it. Well, it wasn't up to her to stop them, it was only her responsibility to make sure they were thinking it through. I can see the headlines now. "All Might and Endeavor's sons sweep local Hanami competition, what will Shoto's dad say?" Izuku suddenly began to deflate, but then Shoto said, "Let him say what he wants, Momo, I want to try this." Standing up, Shoto smirked. Besides, he said, a little teenage rebellion was natural. He looked more determined now, and finally she relented when Izuku perked up happily and said, "Yes. It's all right, Momo will be fine." Suddenly she found herself in charge of the backpack, and Izuku was wrapping his hoodie around his waist as they made their way to the chicken area. Izuku went ahead and signed them up, and Momo turned to her other friend. "Are you sure about this?" Shoto, whose focus had seemed elsewhere, turned to her and offered an assuring nod. "I want to do this." And really, if this is how he wanted to deal with whatever was going on between him and his father, then they'd support him, after all they'd promised. Izuku bounded back smiling. "Okay, so there's going to be a couple matches before we go up, and I guess the team from before already have 2 more victories under their belts." The guy at the booth was all, "Are you sure? These 2 are going to start UA in a few weeks." I just laughed, of course, I mean. "Really?" Shoto shook his head in exasperation, and Momo kind of agreed. "Seriously, just because you got into you didn't mean you were going into the hero course to have such a general warning was pretty silly." But the fact the other team had 7 victories kind of worried her. The 3 of them watched the reigning champion, who apparently were calling themselves AKA and AO. They were pretty good, but Momo thought Izuku and Shoto probably stood a chance against the older boys, but after watching there was really no way she was going to do it. Maybe if the other team had been made up of people she knew as well. Anyways, there wasn't any reason to ponder it. Finally, Izuku and Shoto's turn came, and they were about to enter the ring when Momo caught the glint of her friend's platinum bracelet before calling after him, "Izuku, your bracelet." Izuku looked at her, then to his wrist, and startled before smiling, unclasping it, and jogging back to her. "Thanks. I'd hate to lose that. Easily he clipped it onto her wrist and continued, "Hold that too, please." Then he dashed off and scooped Shoto up onto his shoulders before entering the ring. The announcer was counting down to start and Momo watched intently. She kind of wanted to laugh because seeing the two of her best friends stacked like that was pretty silly looking, especially since Izuku was the shorter one and he was doing the carrying. Suddenly the referee announcer called, "Go," and Momo watched and put one ear to the crowd. There were some teens with their phones out and suddenly Momo heard the first whispers of, "Oh my god, is that Endeavor's son?" And the expected, "Who's that with him?" Oh, probably some friend from his school or something. And they continued to build and more people were taking their phones and cameras out to record Endeavor's son play chicken. She wanted to laugh but made sure to bring her focus back to the match. It was looking pretty close but Izuku, as expected, had really good balance and Shoto was quick with his hands. Suddenly after an 8-second grapple that seemed to last eternity, AKA and AO, were toppled making the crowd go wild. Momo covered her ears because the guy next to her who had got the whole thing on his camcorder was shrieking at the top of his lungs. Izuku, to Momo's utter horror, whooped loudly and spun in place with Shoto holding on to him for dear life. She could barely hear what they were saying but she could tell Shoto didn't appreciate being spun around like a top and Izuku was looking suitably chastised. People were still recording and going mad when Izuku and Shoto's 6 challengers, 2 girls that were a bit older, toppled them over. When it was over, her 2 friends seemed to have had a lot of fun. She'd found it entertaining to watch but she'd found it funnier that everyone was going wild over Shoto. When the 2 returned to her all sweaty and tired, Izuku smiled at her gratefully and accepted his bracelet and hoodie back. Momo refused to hand over the backpack since he'd spent so long carrying Shoto and there was plenty more for them to do. "Hey you two," she smiled, "let's go to the dunk tank so I can dump you both in a couple times." Izuku just laughed and Shoto smirked, showing he was just as amused. Of course it was still a good idea, so they did in fact go to the dunk tank for that exact purpose. Afterwards they ate again and tried to catch goldfish. All of them ended up with a few souvenirs they either won or bought. As the day grew shorter they ate some taiyaki as promised, under a cherry tree, and just enjoyed the silence and company of each other. Izuku had guest meat and ended up with a red bean taiyaki. Surely after doing this for so many years he'd have figured out a secret to telling them apart, but alas he always shoved them all in a bag and never looked at them until after he'd taken a bite. So of course there was no telling what he'd get. His thoughts were interrupted when Shoto announced, "I know I've said it but I want to make sure you know that I've decided to reject my father completely. I'm never using my fire side on another person." Momo, who was laying on her back, sat up straight suddenly and looked extremely shocked at the declaration. Of course Izuku had known something was coming, but to have him suddenly declare that of all things after such a calm and silly day was peculiar. But then, perhaps that was the reason. He felt comfortable and he wanted to share? Either way, Izuku frowned at the announcement. Momo was the first to answer, "Shoto, whatever you feel you need to do, I won't judge you." That gave Izuku a voice. "Shoto, that's a horrible idea." It was Shoto's turn to look shocked and Momo almost looked betrayed, but Izuku trudged forward. "I don't mean you rejecting your dad, like reject him all you want. Change your last name to your mother's when you're of age if you want." Shoto finally seemed to be collecting himself and listening. Momo looked less surprised now. He'd wanted to say a lot of things the night of the ice cream shop meeting, but Shoto had been too raw and hurting to hear them. You can't just shut down a part of yourself. That left half of yours is exactly that, yours and no one else's. Shoto shook his head and frowned. "I refuse to use my father's quirk. I know you can't really understand, but at least dash." "No." Izuku all but shouted. Shoto wasn't understanding him. This wasn't about Endeavor or the fighting. If it was Endeavor's quirk he'd be quirkless right now because you'd have it. "It's yours. I already told you that I'd support you if you became number 1. But that was only if you gave 100%. I can't let you reject a piece of yourself and say you'll make your dreams come true only using half your strength." Shoto stared at him oddly before shaking his head. "I can make it without his power, Izuku. I understand that you don't agree with me, and I suppose that's normal. No one agrees with anyone else on everything. So we'll disagree on this. I'll show you though. I can make it with my mother's power alone." Izuku bit his lip and frowned. He'd said everything he could now. There wasn't anything else he could think of that would change Shoto's mind. Fine. We'll disagree. The silence after that was unsettled for a bit. It weighed on the three of them for a while before Shoto said, "Friends do that, right?" "They disagree." Suddenly a din broke and Izuku was laughing. There was a small prickle of tears he could feel forming in his eyes as he nodded. "Yeah, they disagree." Momo threw herself back onto the floor and declared while heaving an enormous sigh, "We need to do this again, you guys." Shoto smiled again and said, "Izuku and I can take you out on Girls' Day." Izuku felt a rush of approval. "Yeah. We can even go to a princess cafe and stuff for you." Shoto grabbed another taiyaki and bit into it. "We should go to another hanami in February if you want to do something sooner than March." With a laugh, Momo replied, "That sounds nice." And it did. They find out later that the video of them playing chicken went viral. Of course, in the best quality version that had been taken by camcorder, you can hear Momo laughing and cheering. You could even catch a glimpse over her wearing a platinum bracelet. The top-rated comment on that video is, "You fools, that's All Might's son."